I'm Colin Bodell, I'm the CTO of Time. Anybody read Entertainment Weekly or Sports Illustrated, Time, Fortune, all the other brands that we've got? So Time is about a $3.2 billion annual revenue company, headquarters out in New York and offices around the world. And I walked into Time a year ago, February. I actually come from 8 years at Amazon in Seattle. And I came on board as the CTO, EVP of engineering. And I found a couple of interesting things when I walked in through the door. First thing I found is that Time had 5 data centers in various locations around the world. And one of them is on the 21st floor of the Time Life building in New York City at 50th and 6th. And actually, it's not so much on the 21st floor, it kind of is the 21st floor. And that's some of the most expensive and valuable real estate on the planet, and we were using it as a data center, which didn't seem to be the brightest idea that I could possibly imagine. And we had a lot of money locked up in capital. The time to traffic was in the order of months, and when I needed it to be in the order of minutes. And we're just missing a whole lot of capability just in terms of the hosting. And then we were building an awful lot of our own services, for which commodity services were available in things like AWS. So we were spinning out from Time Warner at the time, rolling out as a public company, trying to be very, very cost conscious. So getting out of the data center, I just wanted to be out of the data center business. I wanted much more efficiency, flexibility in all the things that we were doing, and I wanted to save a boatload of cash and be able to turn that back into the company. So when I came on board, I sat down with Keith O'Sullivan, who's our VP of Information Security. And Keith kind of came in a little tentatively, and first time we were meeting, he said to me, what are your priorities? And I said, I'm going to make your day. My top priority is security. And then after that, it's availability, and after that, it's latency. But if we are not secure, then we don't have a right to play. We collect a lot of PII, a lot of credit card information for our subscriptions. Probably about $1.5 billion worth of subscription processing goes through our systems every year. So clearly we need to protect the PII across all of our PCI compliant systems. The other side of it as well, and from a security perspective, is we trade based on trust. When people come to time.com, when they come to fortune.com as 2 good examples, they want news, they want information, they're doing research, they want to be informed. And if we were ever hacked and stories were changed, then it could have significant ramifications. So if you imagine a story in Fortune that was changed or added about a company going public or somebody missing their earnings targets, it could move the market in the shares of that company. So clearly we want to keep the customer information secure, but we also want to keep our sites secure from defacement. And as I'm sure you can imagine, we get attacked an awful lot, being a very public, a very visible organization. So I said to Keith, yeah, security is absolutely number one because of that trust. And as we're moving across to AWS, really good staff inside the company, but moving from our own hosted environment or a colo facility or colo facilities into a cloud environment, clearly we had some of the skill and the expertise in-house necessary to do that work. We also had to bring in a number of partners. And AlertLogic was one partner that we selected pretty early on in the game, and have been an outstanding partner. So I just wanted to kind of frame a little bit about who we are, the journey that we've been on. All of our UK websites are across on AWS, a very high percentage of our US websites, and a lot of our back office systems as well. Hello, is that the space station in there? So, an important business, a very visible business, security being number one, and partnering with the right companies to ensure that we're secure is incredibly important. So now I have pretty much exceeded my knowledge and expertise about security, but that's okay. So I've got Derek and Chris to talk about all of the elements of that journey that we've got along. And nobody will ever say, of course, that your system is perfectly secure, and you'd be fooling yourself if you do that. But touch wood, we've done well so far. But that's why these guys are going to stay up late at night keeping us safe, and I appreciate them doing that for us. All right, guys, I'm going to go sit in the back of the room. I am not sitting up here for an hour.
We were going to pull the chair up for
That's so not going to happen, so let you carry on with these guys. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Colin. I appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. So just a question out to the audience. Back last year, TimeMaker was mandated to move out to the cloud in a very short time frame. So just out to the audience, how many of you guys can relate with us that management mandates us to do something in a very tight deadline, nearly impossible deadline sometimes, with limited resources? Raise a hand, right? So you're in the same boat as us here. So we're on the next slide here. So let's move on to the next slide, please. So the purpose of this conversation that we're going to have today is that we're going to try to address the security in the cloud with the IT and information security managers. I understand that there are some engineers and developers, architects here. It could apply to you too as well. But the focus is really for IT managers and information security managers. What we're going to go through is we're going to talk about the security framework, the building blocks. We're going to go through some of the details and how we build a security framework for TimeMaker. Then we're going to go into the TimeMaker experience, what we went through, the challenges that we faced, the success that we acquired, and the lessons that we've learned. So I'm going to go through that. And the part of the reason why we want to talk about the journey and those experiences is to relate with you guys too as well. The last piece of it is we're going to talk about the action plan, what we did to achieve what we were able to do in terms of building out a security framework in AWS. So by the end of this session, we hope you walk away identifying with many of the problems we face. Our goal is to communicate our achievements, to securing the move to the cloud initiative, and that our story resonates with your security focus. We want you to walk away and go back to the office on Monday morning and be able to take away some of the concepts that we talk about today and apply it to your respective business area. So let's get started. Soon after the mandate, information security began to socialize the security concerns about moving out to the AWS cloud. It's not the same as on-prem security. There is a different characteristic in the AWS cloud. Many of these conversations took place outside of our internal groups. We spoke with numerous security and cloud professionals. We met with various AWS experts. These efforts led us to working with CloudReach as our implementation partner and AlertLogic as our security partner. A key individual to the partnership relationship is Derek Uzzo over here from AlertLogic. Derek will help us tell the TimeMaker story. And the story is one of establishing a successful partnership. Derek and AlertLogic as a whole brought a wealth of information experience from other clients, which we got the chance to benefit from. Their expertise helped us determine the best path forward, so it only makes sense that we have Derek here to help us retell this story. So Derek, can you please tell us a little bit about AlertLogic?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. So let me back up one here. Can I back up? Yep, thanks.
Yep, no problem.
So simply stated, AlertLogic helps its customers produce security outcomes. They do that by providing the security technology, the security content, the security monitoring that's needed 24/7, 365 to produce those outcomes. It's all wrapped up in a service. You can think of it as security as a service. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. AlertLogic specifically is not why I'm here. Chris invited me to help tell the story of our working together over the last year as Time made this transition from traditional on-prem data centers and service provider environments into the AWS cloud. That's a transition that a lot of organizations that I work with are going down. It's probably a transition that a lot of you in the room are either on that path right now or you're considering moving down that path and making plans to do that. Chris talked about experience. I'm a solution engineer at AlertLogic, which is really a cool job. I get a chance to work with great enterprise organizations like Time Inc., really good guys like Chris. I get to help them, as he talked about, with my experience, both in AWS and traditionally, in my background, I was an on-prem data center administrator, owned and was responsible for data centers. Started to work with AWS back in 2008, really just to mess around with it. I was curious about it. Eventually started to use it for some use cases around backup and disaster recovery. sort of transitioned to migrating production workloads to AWS, but it was a different world back then. The reason we moved to Amazon was in order to take advantage of technical features, the flexibility that it provides. Those are still benefits today, but the motivation's a little different today. For somebody like Time Inc., the motivation is business related. It's competitive. It's about revenue. It's about cost reduction. It means that the motivation and the velocity at which they want to migrate to the AWS cloud is very fast, and they need to maintain that in order to achieve those benefits and the outcomes that they're looking for. That really requires that a security team, like Chris and the security team at Time, as an example, take an entirely different approach. It's a new platform, and you've got to think of it that way in order to be successful. This is changing platforms when you move from a traditional data center to the AWS cloud. And that change in approach that the security team takes is really an important component of what we're going to talk about here. So on this slide, you see a number of new terms, a number of new features that you have to consider. These are some of the things that we're going to talk about as we go through the presentation. It's important to understand, though, a lot of traditional considerations just need to be approached in a new way as you make a change to the AWS cloud. Chris, maybe you can talk about some of the initial impressions last summer as we first engaged and you guys started down this path with move to the cloud.
Certainly. So just before I get started about the early stages, how many in the audience here is pretty much at the early stages of going out to AWS, but really specifically wrapping security around AWS? Raise a hand. So, and that's where we were last year. So we're not very different from where you are today for some of you. Some of you guys may have a security program well matured, but there are some challenges, as many of you guys know. So one of the first things we did was we tried to figure out in the early stages is who has an AWS account, right? We have multiple brands, multiple business lines. We have multiple IT divisions serving those business lines, and we didn't know who had AWS accounts. First thing in securing something is knowing who owns it, right? And understanding that environment. So we went even as far as looking at the company P cards to see who actually purchased these accounts. So that's one of the first things that we did at the early stages. The second piece of it is really understanding the AWS technology. You can't protect something that you don't know. So we had to understand these concepts here and many more. These are only like some of the buzzwords and things like that. But what we did was we took a list of all the AWS services, studied them, understand what they were. We worked internally with other staff to have them educate us what they are. And then so we have a path forward with what we're going to do in terms of securing it. So we came to the conclusion after doing a lot of research and a lot of conversations with various different people is that the AWS platform or the tools, they're agile tools with powerful capabilities. The AWS platform itself is infrastructure as a code. So it actually enables and encourages rapid deployments. And all this has to do with this whole DevOps world. And we had to adjust to that. Long are the days where you got developers that are doing development and it's segmented off from the production environment. It's almost as if both worlds are merged. And that's what AWS does, is it merges the both. It makes things move quicker. It makes business sense, actually, right? Because what ends up happening is that you may have a business unit that come up with an idea at 9 o'clock in the morning and said, you know what, I want to put together this fancy web application that will make us a ton of money, whatever that may be, right? There's a justification for it. By 10 a.m. in the morning, right, they start at 9 a.m., by 10 a.m. they scope it out. They talk to the IT support team, the developers, engineers, what have you. And they say, all right, these are our ideas. What do we need to do to get going with this? They collect all that, they scope it out. Quickly, they go out and they start deploying things out in AWS by 11 o'clock, maybe 12 o'clock in the afternoon. And then by 2 p.m., they could potentially have a web application up and running and into production right off the bat in one day. What would take a matter of, in the traditional sense, what would take about weeks, if not months, to procure a server, right? To build an application, to configure the network, to be able to do the QA, pre-prod, and roll out into production. That whole process took weeks, if not months, to do. So that's what AWS capabilities does. It's a business enabler. So naturally, every developer and engineer want to go out to the cloud right out of the gate. So it's like a gold rush back in the Wild Wild West. And I'm going to use that Wild Wild West as a kind of a theme a little bit. This is not to say that AWS is a Wild Wild West. What I'm saying is that when we have engineers and developers that have a mandate and have to come up with a solution for the business so they can make money, they have to go out and do it and execute it. So security is a second thought, right? They might be good people, which they are, right? They have good intentions, but they may be deploying and then putting things out in AWS in an insecure manner. They don't know what they don't know. They think they're doing the right thing, but perhaps they may not be. So that's the concern that we had. So it's clear that deploying your system out to AWS Cloud comes with some major security concerns. So what do we do to migrate securely to the AWS Cloud? Okay.
So you're given a mandate by your CTO. Colin talked about the experience at time. You're focused on achieving benefits that we talked about, or that we showed in one of the first few slides. What do you do to address security? It's really my experience working with organizations like Time that it's best to have a plan to address security, and this is a structure for creating a security framework that gives you the ability to design that security program. It's really very straightforward and simple. The first step is to identify, second step is to evaluate, the third step is to design, and the fourth step is to implement. So let's start with the first phase. Identify security disciplines and outcomes. Identifying them for your organization is important. They're going to stay consistent across platforms, whether you're in an on-prem data center or you're in AWS, but they're going to be unique per organization. So it's important to identify those for your organization. Chris, maybe you can talk about the initial disciplines, security disciplines and outcomes that you guys chose.
Sure, Derek. So one of the first things we did was that we had to go back to the basics of security. Security, the on-prem model, doesn't really change just because we move out to the AWS cloud. The disciplines remain relatively the same. We can go to the next slide. So going out to AWS, these are the basic concepts here, as you see on my left-hand side and the right-hand side, obviously, is that we have access management, application security, data security, InfoSec, governance and oversight, network security, right? And then we also have system security. Those things still apply in the AWS. So for example, in the AWS world, you still need a proper IDAM process and controls. You still need multi-factor to access into your value assets, right? The environment where they hold sensitive data, you will want multi-factor authentication in place. When we talk about application security, the web application vulnerabilities from the OWASP top 10 doesn't change. That attack vector still remains the same, whether you're on the on-prem or whether you're in the cloud in AWS. And then I'm going to hone in on a little bit about the information security governance piece of it, because I think that it's easy to say that we can put tools out there, but without a process, without standardization, right, without some guidelines by which people are supposed to function and deploy things out in the AWS, all the tools in the world doesn't mean anything. So the governance and oversight piece is an important and critical component of what we did from an information security standpoint. Then we go down to the data level, right? Data classification still applies, right? That doesn't go away. We have some financial firms here. We have some firms here that are HIPAA compliant, or Colin up here earlier on talked about PII, protecting Time Inc.'s PII data. We're also PCI. We have to be PCI compliant. So all that stuff, all those regulations still applies. So none of that goes away. So these are the disciplines, these are the foundations that does not change, and that's what we have to remember. Now, based on the disciplines, right, and the basics and the foundations, we come up with outcomes. And when I say outcomes, they're essentially objectives, right? What we wanted to achieve from a security standpoint. So we talk about standards and processes, intrusion detection, log correlation. We're talking about what the WAF, web application firewall. These are some of the high-level key objectives that we had. These are the outcomes. Later on in this conversation, we're going to go back to these outcomes because we're going to map it with solutions. It's great that we talk about what we want to achieve, but unless we do something about it, it doesn't mean anything. But I just want to set the tone that we have some outcomes that we have to achieve.
So the next stage of the framework is to evaluate your use of AWS. In my experience working with different organizations, I find they use AWS for different reasons. They have different use cases. Not just the organizations, but the groups within an organization may use AWS very differently. Identifying what those use cases are is important. Are they using it to make web applications available? Are they using, is the use case to extend compute capacity and compute resources? Are they leveraging the elasticity that the cloud provides? It's also important in that to identify where you've got traditional security solutions like security tools that may or may not be able to migrate to AWS. Can you use those same tools in the Amazon environment to work and function and provide value the same way that they have in the past?
Oh, sorry. So there was a mandate to move out to the cloud. We have to move very quickly. Right over here at the time, this was back in the last summer of 2014, we had data centers in co-locations on-prem and hosted data centers internally. We have three, and this is at the high level, it's not all the divisions, but we had, at that point in time, we had 3 disparate divisions, e-com, web applications, right? And then we also had other ones in the pipeline ready to go out to the AWS environment. So what does it mean? What we had to do is kind of understand the functional areas from an IT perspective, right? There were divisions using microinstances for APIs and others using RDS and Redshift for ingestion and transformation of ad sales data. And there was others leveraging EC2 instances with Apache servers, and others recently were doing a huge initiative with the big data computing. So we have to understand these use cases. There were multiple use cases, and we didn't have a predefined use of AWS. This is back at the time. We had to quickly get up to speed and understand what are the predefined use case for each of these divisions. And they were disparate, so we couldn't unify it. We had to cater fit to those business solutions. So it's critical for us to understand the different characteristics of use and its implications. You can't protect what you don't know.
So as Chris is describing the state of things last summer at AWS, or at Time Inc., there were some important characteristics that he identified that you really have to be aware of in order to pull out, and they may exist in your organization. One of those is infrastructure was already up and running in production. You can't just rip everything down and then come up with a security plan and build it all back without disrupting the business. So you've got to take that into account and identify when that's the case. Also, the way in which they were using AWS was very dynamic, doing a lot of auto-scaling. It was growing very, very quickly. Identifying that's an important component to successfully implementing a security program. Another key factor that I see in a lot of organizations that's different than your past traditional on-prem data centers is the autonomy that's available in AWS. A lot of times, even enterprise organizations, and probably more, as much or more with enterprise organizations, you've got disparate groups that have the ability to just spin up infrastructure. It's not going through a central server operations team or infrastructure team anymore. Because of that, because so many individuals can create infrastructure, there's no central gatekeeper, no place to implement security policy and security process like there's been in the past. Also, working with traditional security tools that don't transfer over to AWS is an important thing to identify. As we talked about, which solutions can we utilize and which ones can we not utilize. So by understanding how these different groups are using AWS, you can now move to the design phase and begin to design your security program. This starts with understanding your responsibility in AWS when it comes to security. You guys will notice on this slide, the orange sections are what AWS is responsible for. And they're responsible for a lot. But you do have a responsibility for security in AWS, and if you're not aware of it, it's very important that you become familiar with it. The things you see here at the foundational level, the physical data centers that underlie all the virtualization that takes place, AWS takes care of it. The physical security around all that hardware and all those data centers. That's great. They also take care of a lot at the network level, as you can see in the orange part of the slide. Managing those networks, managing logical segmentation across those networks, hardening the hypervisor at the host level, those are all responsibilities of AWS. But in the black section here, starting at the top, Your responsibility, of course, is around the code that goes out there. You've got to make sure that you're writing good code. You've got to make sure that you know when there's application vulnerabilities that may exist in your code, and you need to be able to scan for that. You've got to take care of patching those applications and updating them as necessary. You've also got to manage access management to the application when it exists. And you've got to look for application level attacks, things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, patch reversal. They're on you to look for those types of exploit attempts against your applications. Most people kind of get that when they go to AWS. Where they sometimes aren't nearly as aware initially is at the host level. You are responsible for the operating system that's running on those instances. You've got to patch those systems. You've got to check for vulnerabilities and know which systems need to be updated. You've got to manage the access management to those systems. So not just in AWS, but you've got to manage the domain admin accounts on those servers. If you want to set the password to the same name as your company, AWS isn't going to stop you from doing that. So you've got to have the proper policies and processes in place, change control in place to be able to manage that. You also want to monitor logs and be able to have an audit trail from the operating systems themselves and that underlying framework for good security, and that's typically important for compliance. At the network layer, you still have some responsibilities. You need to configure the network architecture. You need to configure the subnets. You need to configure the security that exists at that level, and you need to monitor for attacks like malware, Trojans, application, or network level attacks, brute force attacks. And you need to be able to detect and remediate those types of threats. So Chris, what was your experience at Time Inc. with how you guys understood the shared security responsibility when you got started?
Well, I can say that it was quite challenging. There were a lot of people who went out to the AWS environment already, and a lot of them kind of had this misunderstanding that once you deploy out in AWS, you are secure because that's what AWS said. Below the hypervisor, they are secure. Their infrastructure is certainly secure. They are meeting many of the regulatory high standard requirements, right? But what we do, as Derek talked about, what we do on top of the hypervisor is the customer's responsibility. So just a quick question out in the audience, just a general question, how many of you guys face that kind of challenge when you worked with the developers of the architecture and the engineering team and the business team, and they had a hard time understanding that AWS isn't entirely secure because there is a security responsibility from the customer's perspective? How many of you guys kind of faced that challenge where they didn't quite understand it? Okay, so we got a couple, but I guess most companies really educate themselves now. But in the early stages, we kind of had that, some misunderstanding of this here. So it was very important for us to kind of really educate, work internally, educate, socialize, and really collaborate with the other internal partnership here. So part of Time Inc.'s strategy was that we need to understand all the use cases that Time Inc. was using AWS. We just went over the complexity and described how the deployment and configuration of AWS can be like the Wild Wild West. To address this, it's really about people, process, and technology. All three of those things the underlying principle has to come into play when we're talking about security. We started by creating security standards and processes. We also created infrastructure standards, which included the build out of what we call HLDs and LLDs. This is with the help of CloudReach. HLDs are high-level designs, and LLDs are low-level designs. These documents helped us understand the lay of the land, the components and the services that we're using and how they were using it and for what business purpose. So now let's talk about the technology. Where do we begin, Derek, from a technical and architecture review perspective?
Well, let's start at the same place that you and I started when we first met, and that's with your reference architecture.
Okay, so I know what a reference architecture is, but can you describe to the audience what a reference architecture is?
Yeah, absolutely. So a reference architecture is very much like a network diagram. It is a diagram that helps everyone get on the same page with a lot of information, complex information, about what is the approved way to deploy architecture in AWS. It's really vital, not just for the organization to have a reference architecture, but to have a library of reference architectures for the different use cases that we talked about earlier for these different groups that are using AWS. And it's a very important way for the security team, the InfoSec team, to communicate out what's been approved to those application developers that Chris talked about earlier.
So let me add that from a timing perspective, this was a critical piece here. Understanding the reference architecture helped us to kind of give a deeper and clearer understanding of what our environment is like. Without it, we really didn't have a picture of it. People can talk about it, but we can't depict it, what the environment looks like. It doesn't help. So Derek, let's look at what a reference architecture actually looks like. Absolutely.
So this is sort of the starting point for the reference architecture that we're going to build out here. Any experienced AWS engineer looks at this and says it's a mess when it comes to security, and it absolutely is. This is spinning up 3 instances in a public subnet and putting elastic IPs on each one of them, and it works. But it's not secure at all. It's not highly available, and those are some major limitations. But I see a lot of organizations that sort of start out this way. You'd be surprised at how many I end up working with, even large enterprises that are in production with architectures that look similar to this. Now, this isn't Time's architecture, by the way. This is just a starting point for us, right, Chris?
Yeah, I would say so, because if this was our architecture, it's not a very good architecture, and we would never approve it. So
admittedly, it's an extreme case at this point, so let's start to build it out. What we've changed here is we've moved the instances back to public subnets. You can see we've implemented an elastic load balancer, a very important way to provide a highly available hop that traffic can come into, and then it can auto-scale and it can distribute traffic across those internal instances. By spreading them across availability zones, of course, it's highly available. And this particular architecture right now is just showing web application traffic. That's all we've added to it. But you can see the security groups over on the right side that start to build out as we expand this architecture. So in this example, we've added now inbound management traffic. It's important for administrators to be able to access these systems. In a Linux environment, administrators want to be able to SSH into the appliance. In a Windows environment, they want to be able to RDP into the appliance. You don't want to set elastic IPs on these instances so they go straight to them, because that typically means you've exposed them to whoever you've given access to be able to connect to that, and others who may be able to take advantage of trying to exploit those systems. So in this example, we've added bastion hosts to the front-end public subnets. That's a good way of moving the instances back to private subnets, but still being able to give access to them through a central jump point, or something that you can control, which is what those bastion hosts represent. You can see as the slide starts to build out, there's more and more information as those security groups build out as well. In this example, we've added outbound traffic. It's very common for instances to be able to, or need to be able to do software upgrades, security patching, to be able to make calls and connections out to the internet. The fact that they're in private subnets means that they typically can't do that. What we're showing in this example is actually leveraging a proxy across availability zones, and that outbound proxy being the way that you can control outbound traffic, so that you could open it up just to those external sources that are needed for the software updates. Again, the purpose of the reference architecture, and you can start to really see it here, is to communicate large amounts of information across a large group of people and make sure everybody's on the same page. One of the big advantages to using AWS, as Chris has alluded to, infrastructure as code, right? Being able to use CloudFormation templates, build them to represent this approved reference architecture from a security team, now becomes a consistent way to deploy the same architecture over and over again that's been approved and that you know is secure, and you don't have individuals who can spin up infrastructure kind of going rogue and setting up their own insecure architectures. So Chris, talk a little bit how you guys leveraged the reference architectures that you built at Time.
Certainly. So from our perspective back last year, I think having a handle on what a reference architecture is and what the purpose it serves for us from a security standpoint was actually the pivotal point in understanding our environment and knowing what are the controls that we need to place and where are the gaps. And then once we have this depiction, right, and this is a very simple architecture design, there's a lot more complex, and I'm sure your environment is much more complex than this. This isn't only a sample, but in a much more larger and complex environment, we really need to understand where all these components are. So that was critical for us. So now we talked about the technical piece and talked about the architectural piece of it, that, what do we need to do in order to protect the environment, but it's based on the architecture design. But now we got to go into what are the key success factors, right, From our perspective, we actually, I'm going to go through this real quick here, and then we'll go into details right afterwards. We conducted a risk assessment. We understood what the new AWS security concepts were. We sought after managed security solutions. We looked into internal partnership, and then we defined our requirements. So one of the groups that went out to AWS, so we're getting right into here, is that in conducting the risk assessment, a lot of, many of you may understand risk assessment as these control sheets on the left-hand side, and have we met these controls, right? And usually it's a list of 100 plus, 200, 300 controls, right? So we sort of did that, but in addition to that, we also did a light pen test. We tested against one of the web applications, one of the environments that told us, the division told us that they believed that they were secure. They believed they did the right thing, and we trusted them. But we also, from a security standpoint, we always trust but validate. And that's what we did. We validated by doing a pen test against the environment. And of course, we found some findings here. Nothing huge, but one thing we discovered was this, is that their environment was susceptible to web application attacks. There were too many silos of log data and insufficient log correlation for us to do any forensics and incident response work. There was lack of perimeter protection. So we could get into the environment and the bells and alarms wouldn't go off. So it was lack of alerting and monitoring at the same time. From an AppSec perspective, this is how we test security posture of an application or an environment. But our job doesn't end there in identifying the gaps in the vulnerabilities. We needed to know how the underlying security technologies and how it's implemented. So Derek, can you please explain the AWS security concept?
So a few things here that you may or may not be familiar with that we want to talk about real quick. VPCs, right? Virtual private clouds. It really gives you the way of segmenting a network in AWS and controlling access to it through an access control list, much like you would have a perimeter firewall. For administration purposes in security, it's very valuable. Security groups are also kind of a new concept. It's really a host-based stateful firewall. And it gives you the ability in AWS to have a much higher level of security than you might on an traditional on-prem data center, because typically host-based firewalls aren't leveraged and utilized in those environments. CloudTrail is also a big concept to understand. It's really just audit logging for the activity that either takes place through the AWS Management Console or APIs. IAM, Identity and Access Management, somebody needs the permissions to make changes in AWS, and this gives you the ability to control at a fine granular level access to data and access to systems. And then KMS, key management systems. Data encryption is an important component of security. Managing keys for data encryption is always a challenge. KMS makes that much, much easier. So to define requirements, really the first question you always have to ask is, what are we protecting? Usually that starts with data and applications and networks, and also systems. Attackers want to steal your data. They want to gain control of your systems. They want to find a weakness to exploit and be able to obtain legitimate credentials in order to be able to access those systems. So preemptively securing in these areas is extremely important. Chris, why don't you describe the requirements that you guys identified at time in these areas?
Sure. So in the next slide here, coming up here, is that we kind of bulleted some of the key high-level requirements. Of course, our requirements list was much longer, and I don't think we have the time nor the PowerPoint slides to list all those requirements. So we kind of bubbled it up a little bit. And we divided it into hard requirements and soft requirements. Our hard requirements are the actual technical controls that we wanted. And a lot of this requirement was based on the outcomes, the objectives that I talked about earlier on during this conversation. So we identified that we need IDS, intrusion detection, right, to protect the perimeter. We talk about vulnerability scanning to understand the security posture of our systems that's out in the AWS environment. We talk about web application firewall, as well as 24/7 SOC monitoring, because we don't have, security doesn't end at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the evening. It's around the clock. So we need somebody monitoring this piece of it. And there's AWS account services auditing. And then we go from hard requirements to soft requirements. And part of the soft requirements, this is important for us here, because when we do partnership external to a managed security service provider, we need to make sure that this provider is able to move at the velocity of the business demands. we had to move very quickly out in AWS, and we had to do it in a secure manner. So the velocity and to meet the velocity of the business demand was a big piece of it. And of course, we had different things that we talked about, disparate groups, which means is the disparate divisions, right? We had align with the DevOps model, which I talked about earlier, about agile tools and infrastructure as a code, which is what a AWS platform is, right? And then we also had to look at the long-term strategy in this partnership. It wasn't a short-term gain. We needed a long-term gain with the partnership. So we identified the outcome, just to summarize it, right? But what was the solution? So I talked about outcomes earlier. Now we have to come up with solutions. Now, these are the basic solutions that we have, and as you can see here, I'm pointing to the left mostly because most people are looking left, but also to the right too as well. All right, so we listed at the outcomes here, which is very similar to the outcomes that I talked about earlier in the conversation. And we discovered that Alert Logic, and it's not to sell Alert Logic, but really Alert Logic cover a lot of the outcomes that we wanted to achieve, from IDS to log correlation, incident response, the WAF piece of it. They really cover that, not only from a product perspective, but they covered it from a service provider perspective, and that was the key, and this is what I was talking about in the soft requirements. But Alert Logic is not a silver bullet. It's not one solution saying, oh, just because we have Alert Logic, we're completely secure. There's a lot of facets and a lot of components in securing an environment. We have to look at, vulnerability assessment. While Alert Logic has a vulnerability scanner, we were already using Qualys for internal vulnerability assessment as well as external and web application testing. We're talking about file integrity, which met with some of our PCI controls. We were using Tripwire. And then we have endpoint security with antivirus, which we use Trend Micro for. And obviously, firewall management. You got to control the firewalls, right? The ingress, egress traffic and how it's routed within our network and our environment. So we're looking at Dome 9 and AlgoSec potentially to cover that for us at this point. But the most important piece of this whole thing, again, is that, and I talked about it, alluded to this earlier, is that it's about the standards and processes. You can throw all the tools at something, but it can only sit on the shelf and not do anything unless we have a process and we have standards and we have people working within those processes and standards. So let's go into what Alert Logic actually provided us here. They provided us the intrusion detection system, right? We were able to respond to incidents and events. More importantly, we actually understood that as many of you guys, for those who are in the incident response team, know that there's hundreds, thousands, millions of events that comes through, right? How do you parse it out and get the instance out of it? Alert Logic was able to help us out with this here. Because if we did that ourselves, we just simply didn't have the staff or the time to be able to do that on our own. We had to move quickly, like I said, move at the velocity of the business demand. We also had to scale people because we didn't have the ability to hire additional staff and train them and make sure that they're working what they were supposed to do. We had to get somebody on board right away who was specialized in 24/7 SOC monitoring. And it was difficulty. One of the biggest, the other difficulty that we ran into was that we had to manage and create security content and build out security intelligence. All these events coming in, all these incidents coming in, you gotta be able to correlate and you gotta build content out of it. And we didn't have the time to do that kind of threat assessment and threat analysis. So Derek, can you help explain in more detail what a managed security solutions and how it helped us?
Yeah, absolutely. Chris kind of explained this in the description of why he chose Alert Logic. As a managed solution, you've got to be able to cover all the components that are necessary to produce those security outcomes. Traditionally, people buy products. They need to become experts at those products and manage them and buy different products for different areas, and then they've got to have the internal knowledge to work with those individual tools. They've also got to build content. Chris talked a little bit about that. Building content to make those tools work is an important component that not everyone considers. You've got to write signatures, you've got to write rules, you've got to write content that's specific to look for and alert on things that are taking place in your environment. And then, of course, last but not least, is the people component. You've got to have good security people to produce good security outcomes. And if you're going to do good security, you got to cover all three of these if you manage it and do it internally. So in order to move at the velocity that time was moving, from traditional data centers into AWS to maintain that velocity and make sure that security did not become a bottleneck and security concerns did not reduce that velocity of moving. Choosing a managed service really, really helped in that.
So we looked at external partnership, and that was AlertLogic and CloudReach and other partners that I'm not listing over here for this purpose of this presentation. But as heavy and as much as we concentrate on an external partnership, we also had to do the same thing with internal partnership. You know, as in many of you security folks understand, is that security is everybody's business, right? It's not a silo event or activity or accountability and responsibility just on the information security team. It really spreads across, it permeates across the firm. Everybody needs to be a part of this. Everybody needs to understand it. And it was critical for us to make sure that the internal partnership was there. Because without them, you know, they won't understand what the security is and they don't understand the importance of it. And the likelihood of them to follow the process and procedures and implement the controls that we needed to protect Time Inc. wouldn't be that. And vice versa, right? We can't protect something that we don't understand. So we have expertise in various IT organizations. They were experts in their respective area. Security, as you know, is a mile wide and an inch deep. So we really need to, we couldn't understand, 5-inch deep, 10-inch deep, or feet deep into a specific discipline. We know across multiple disciplines, but we need the internal partnership to kind of communicate back to us, to educate us what the technology is and how we're actually using that technology to fit that business purpose. So it's critical that we have to have this internal partnership.
So that brings us to the last stage of the framework, implementing a security program. In many cases, this can be the most challenging of all the phases because unlike the past where we talked about the central gatekeepers that you could implement a security program and policy through, now you've almost got to socialize it. You've got to bring in those groups that you're internally partnering with in order to get this accomplished. And that's sort of what we broke out here, talking about those internal partnerships and talking about the policy frameworks, the reference architectures that we've described, the outcomes that we've mapped to solutions. At this point, it's about socializing that information out to the groups that need to be partnered with to implement it. That can be done through webinars, it can be done through wiki pages. Those are the key stakeholders that, with the security team, partner to implement this security program. What's extremely important in this new world is for a security team to understand that they've got to monitor the implementations. It's not good enough just to create a security program and policy and say, this is the way we're going to do it based on this reference architecture. They need to go and periodically check and make sure that those security policies are being followed and those implementations are being done according to that. Chris, what's the status of where you guys are in implementing your security program? Okay,
so fast forward to today, from last summer to now, where we're at is that we've been able to accomplish a lot of what we just talked about, this conversation throughout this last almost 50 minutes now. We were able to establish a reference architecture. This was very critical for us. We were able to build out an AWS Security Standards checklist. So what does that mean? It means that when a business line needs to go out to AWS, there's a process to follow by. And that's a pretty much a locked-in step process where we work together and then we go through the checklist to make sure that it adheres to the security controls that we want that will protect the firm at the end of the day. We also devised a database security standard. Then we went into, obviously, we looked into AlertLogic and we're partnering with AlertLogic with a lot of the security stuff that we just talked about, including IDS, log correlation, and web application firewall, as well as have a deeper insight into the AWS environment. And then we also addressed our outcomes and mapped with the solutions. So like I said before, AlertLogic is not a silver bullet, right? It covered a lot of the outcomes and the objectives that we were looking for, but doesn't solve everything. So a lot of legwork we still had to do, and we're underway. I would say that at this point, we're fairly mature. There's always a lot of room to grow, just as AWS have a lot of products. Today, this whole week, there's an onslaught of different products. Now we got to jump into it and learn those products. So that's critical for us, right? We know what we have now, but we don't know what we have, come today, actually, and tomorrow. So we need to address those things. And the key thing is that when we do security, security is kind of known as somewhat of a roadblock. It may slow things down, right? And that's really the purpose of it. It's the nature of the beast. We can't move as quickly as a developer wants to move, but we can try to move at the velocity of the business demands. And that was the key part. And Alert Logic really helped us out with this piece of it.
So Chris, maybe you can tell the audience about what the current status of the mandate is, the move to the cloud mandate.
Okay, so here in the next slide here, this gives a quick snapshot of where we're at in terms of percentage of completion. As you can see, some of the areas, and I broke it down by kind of functional names, not so much of the names of the business. But you'll see that several areas were 100% out there already. And when I say 100% out there already, it means that we also have security wrapped around it, from security technical controls to processes and standards, right? And there's other areas that we're inching our way through and we're progressing ahead. So I think we've made a lot of good progress throughout. So this concludes our conversations for today. We hope you can get back to the office on Monday armed with the following, right? And just a quick recap. And identify by sharing with you what Timing's journey was. It discussed the building blocks to building a security framework, the actions and plans we took in order to put together a successful security program. And again, going back to, we focus on people, process, and technology. We hope you enjoyed today's session. Thank you very much.
So if anybody would like to ask questions or come visit with us after the session, Chris and I will both be available. You see our contact information up here.
That's not a picture. I don't know who put that picture up there.
Feel free to reach out to us.
I actually don't smoke.
Also, there's a link at the bottom. So I posted Visio versions of the reference architectures that we presented. So if you want to get your hands on those and sort of use that as a template to build out a reference architecture, go to the link. You'll also find our cloud security report at alertlogic.com. Also urge you to come by our booth and talk to us. I'll be there for a while. And we've got a brand new product specifically for AWS called Cloud Insight, which sort of maps out your current environment as it's running today and does vulnerability scanning on demand. So that's really something exciting to talk about. Thank you.